Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Kiana K. Irvin, Assistant Professor of History here at MU, and I work with Dr. Gary Kramer. He's the Executive Director of the State Historical Society of Missouri, and Mary Ellen Lohman, the Senior Strategic Communications Associate of the Historical Society. Together, we curate lectures by leading scholars of Missouri African American history. And over the course of 5 seasons, we have hosted more than a dozen scholars, all of whom have made a compelling case for the significance of Missouri's Black history as a standalone field and as an important contributor to the study of the nation's racial past. And we're very proud of our lecture series, and this endeavor depends on multiple programs and many people. So we'd like to thank the Missouri Humanities Council, the State Historical Society of Missouri, and the University of Missouri's Division of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity for providing a platform. And thanks too to the staff of these programs and to the many friends who support us. It's my distinct honor to introduce our lecturer for this evening, Dr. Priscilla A. Dowden-White. Dr. Dowden-White is Associate Professor of History at the University of Missouri, where she currently serves as undergraduate director and teaches a variety of courses on African American history, United States history since 1865, and the history of St. Louis. She holds a BA in history from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, an MPS in African and African American studies from Cornell University, and a PhD in history from Indiana University, Bloomington. Her scholarly interests include social welfare and civic activism among African Americans during the interwar period of World War I and World War II. Dr. Dowden-White is the author of the recently published book titled Groping Toward Democracy, African American Social Welfare Reform in St. Louis, 1910 to 1949. George Lipsitz, a preeminent scholar of race, class, and Black social movement history, and author of a deeply influential biography of the St. Louis-based Black housing rights activist Ivory Perry, says that Professor Dowden-White's book is a well-researched and carefully argued study that, quote, shows how community leaders steeped in traditions of social welfare progressivism use the idea of the community as a whole and the ideal of a democratic public culture to forge alliances and win victories in struggles against residential segregation and other forms of racial exclusion. Indeed, Groping Toward Democracy broke new ground, providing a blueprint for telling the story of St. Louis's Black past through the perspective of the community builders who profoundly shaped city life. Professor Dowden-White has been a featured scholar in several historical documentaries. Among them are Sing It, Tell It, a documentary exploring the African-American musical heritage of Missouri, Decades, a series on the history of St. Louis since the 1904 World's Fair, Made in the USA, East St. Louis, and the Jewish American Experience. During the fall semester 2007, Professor Dowden-White served as co-coordinator of the Missouri Africa program and faculty in residence at the University of Ghana, where she taught a course on the African diaspora. During the summer of 2014, Professor Dowden-White presented on the Black freedom struggle in the US at the University of South Africa in Pretoria. Dr. Dowden-White is currently editing and annotating the unpublished memoir of Urban League Executive Secretary John T. Clark, and researching and writing a biography on the life of the late attorney and civil rights leader Margaret Bush Wilson. I can tell you now this forthcoming project will be a must-read, so look for it. Please note that after Professor Dowden-White's talk, we'll have a book signing that will immediately follow Q&A. So join me in welcoming Dr. Priscilla Dowden-White.
The other mic on.
Good evening. I am elated to be here this evening, and I'd like to thank you for coming. I'd like to thank Dr. Kiana Irving and Dr. Gary Kramer for inviting me to give this lecture among what has been such a distinguished field of presenters that have come before me. I thank the State Historical Society of Missouri, along with the University of Missouri's Division of Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity for their sponsorship. I'd also like to thank Mary Ellen Lohman for so graciously taking care of all of the behind the scenes, the scene details for this occasion. A special thanks to Kiana for the kind introduction and for the inspiration that she has provided for me as a scholar. I'm a little under the weather tonight, so I need you to send me your positive energy. My talk this evening comes from the research that I have currently underway on a biography of the late attorney and civil rights leader, Margaret Bush Wilson. When I began this research, I was immediately struck first by the massiveness of Margaret's collection of papers, which constitute approximately 800 boxes of primary source material. For Margaret was intentional about sharing many of her ideas, perspectives, and often her innermost thoughts on paper. She was also intentional about leaving behind a record of her life and contributions. I shall never forget how, upon sharing with a colleague that Margaret's papers are comprised of more than 800 linear feet of materials, my colleague said, "Wow, she certainly thought a lot of herself, didn't she?" And indeed, she did. As an historian and her biographer, I am not only interested in writing about Margaret Bush Wilson's life as a needed and well-deserved act of historical recovery on yet another unsung female civil rights leader. I am also interested in what Margaret's life has to teach us as a nation about who we are, who we were over the 90-year period of her life, from her birth in 1919 to her passing in 2009. Finally, I am interested in what made Margaret tick. I'm interested in her decision-making process, in what motivated her to act. Louis Maynard, author of the 2002 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Metaphysical Club, A Story of Ideas in America, describes pragmatism when understood as a process, as an act, or an account rather, of the way people think, the way they come up with ideas, form beliefs, and reach decisions. No book-length biographies or academic articles have been published to date on Margaret Bush Wilson. Published biographical summaries exist in encyclopedias and in newspaper articles, including obituaries published following her passing in 2009. Most of these brief bios only serve to highlight the contributions of a woman of African descent, as Margaret commonly defined members of her ethnic group, to the 20th century Black freedom struggle. An example of these brief biographical descriptions read as follows. Margaret Bush Wilson broke many barriers throughout her life and professional career. Born January 30th, 1919 in St. Louis to parents who were active in the city's local NAACP chapter, Wilson was one of the first graduates to receive a law degree from the segregated Lincoln University Law School in Missouri, established as a result of the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Missouri Gaines v. Canada, 1938. Only the second woman of color licensed to practice law in Missouri, Wilson became an attorney for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Electrification Administration and was part of the legal team that successfully challenged the constitutionality of race-restrictive covenants in the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Shelley v. Kramer, 1948. That same year, Wilson became the first Black woman in Missouri to run for Congress, running on the ticket of the Progressive Party of Henry A. Wallace. She would later serve as Assistant Attorney General of Missouri and Legal Services Specialist in Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. During her tenure as Acting Director of the St. Louis Model Cities Housing Agency from 1968 to 1969, Wilson was a staunch advocate for community participation. Wilson held leadership positions, previously held by men at the local, state, and national levels of the NAACP. And in 1975, Wilson became the first woman of color and only the second female to chair the National NAACP Board of Directors. This distinction, along with her unilateral decision to suspend the organization's national director, Reverend Benjamin Hooks, over fiscal and managerial incompetence, and her subsequent dismissal as board chair, placed Wilson in a national spotlight. In her lifelong struggle to advance freedom and equality for African Americans, women, and all those who were excluded from the mainstream of society, Margaret Bush Wilson blazed a courageous legal trail marked by landmark decisions and major advances that opened up doors to equal opportunity for all Americans. Now, without interrogating the lines on Margaret Bush Wilson's resume, the summary I just narrated fits comfortably into what we might call the standard progressive civil rights narrative. The standard progressive civil rights movement narrative. How is this narrative changed, however, or complicated when we learn the following? In 1978, through Wilson's leadership, the NAACP stunned old liberal allies by breaking with President Carter and urging the adoption of an energy policy that tracked closely with the oil industry's position. In 1991, Wilson, a strong supporter of affirmative action policies, would speak before the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee in support of Clarence Thomas's nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 2008, Wilson, a strong proponent of the ERA, who had spoken on its behalf to the Missouri Senate in 1980, stood before protesting students and faculty who turned their backs at the Washington University commencement exercise when Wilson presented the citation awarding the conservative, anti-feminist Phyllis Schlafly an honorary degree. How do these details complicate the progressive civil rights narrative biography of Margaret Bush Wilson? Are we to assume that she got progressively more conservative with age? Did she push for a pragmatic alliance between big oil, big government, and big minority as a way to reward African American friends in the oil industry's employ, or because of her own ties as a member of several major corporations, including Monsanto? Was she a mere opportunist? Had she sold out? Did her support of Clarence Thomas's nomination represent a still bitter Wilson, as she was described by one journalist who wanted to thumb her nose at the NAACP board that dismissed her following her unilateral suspension of Benjamin Hooks? During the conclusion of my talk this evening, I'll come back to these particular details that serve to, again, complicate how we may think about what it means to be a civil rights leader or activist in this understanding that we may have of what it means to be progressive. Pragmatism as a process is an account, again, of the way that people think, the way they come up with ideas, form beliefs, and reach decisions. It is also a philosophy of thought, a uniquely American philosophy that originated in the 1870s, became popular in the early 20th century, and had revivals and wanes subsequently. Its origins are often attributed to the philosophers William James, John Dewey, Charles Sanders Peirce. According to pragmatism, the truth or meaning of an idea or proposition lies in its observable, practical consequences rather than in its mere or any metaphysical attributes. Pragmatism can be summarized by the phrase, whatever works is likely true. Because reality changes, according to the view of pragmatism, whatever works will also change. Thus, truth must be regarded as changeable, which means that no one can claim to possess any final or ultimate truth. The so-called classical period of American philosophy, best known for its creation of American pragmatism, was developed in the United States from the late 19th to the middle of the 20th century. In addition to John Dewey and William James and Charles Sanders Peirce, we find Jane Addams and W.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke and George Herbert Mead, Hosea Royce and Alfred North Whitehead among the field of important pragmatists. Waning in popularity after the Second World War, American pragmatist philosophy enjoyed a revival in the 1970s and often is credited to the neo-pragmatist work of Richard Rorty. Far from being anti-theoretical in its position that champions level-headed practicality, as is sometimes thought, pragmatist philosophy stresses the dynamic relationship between theory and practice, and especially the value of each for transforming the other. It seeks to undermine sharp dichotomies as well, including those dichotomies between mind and body, subject and object, ends and means, nature and culture. Pragmatists believe that all philosophical concepts should be judged according to their practical uses and successes, not on the basis of abstractions. Pragmatist philosophy stresses the dynamic relationship between theory and practice, and especially, again, for the value of each for transforming the other. In his 2011 book, Reading Obama, Dreams, Hopes, and the American Political Tradition, the Harvard historian James T. Kloppenberg argues that pragmatism is a philosophy for skeptics, a philosophy for those committed to democratic debate and the critical assessment of the results of political decisions, not for true believers convinced that they know the right course of action in advance of inquiry and experimentation. Rather than grounding values in a bedrock of timeless absolutes, pragmatists urge us to evaluate all our beliefs, philosophical, scientific, religious, ethical, and political, before the test they consider the most demanding of all, our experience as social and historical beings. Now, while pragmatism doesn't adhere to absolutes or ideology, this does not mean that pragmatists have no guiding principles. And one of the guiding principles, in fact, the guiding principle that I think forms the most secure thread, the longest thread that runs throughout Margaret Bush Wilson's practice and thought, is that of the idea of natural aristocracy. The quote here says that there is a natural aristocracy among men, the grounds of which are virtue and talent. That was Thomas Jefferson's idea of a natural aristocracy. Margaret Bush Wilson borrowed from Thomas Jefferson's notion of natural aristocracy, and she placed herself firmly within this natural aristocracy. She says, "Without hesitation, I firmly assert that there is an American aristocracy, and I'm a part of it." And she said to her audiences when she would speak, she says, "As you and all your members can and may be too, I do not speak, of course, of an aristocracy of birth and class and wealth. My definition of an American aristocrat, thanks to Thomas Jefferson, is one with the salient qualities of exemplary character, proven competence, and solid personal achievement. Character, competence, and accomplishment. With such standards, any of us," Margaret Bush Wilson argued, "any of us, citizens of the United States, can be American aristocrats." In February 1988, Margaret Bush Wilson spoke to the Mutual of New York staff and officers for Black History Month. She described her purpose in speaking to the staff that her purpose was to suggest that Black History Month was now more than a celebration of Black people. In her judgment, Black History Month had become the one time in our whole year when we are about celebrating the promise of America. No other group in this country, she proclaimed, represents so vividly the promise of America and the struggle to achieve what it is all about than the people of African descent. In 2003, Wilson would refer to her concept of natural aristocracy as her whole philosophy. In speaking about St. Louis's failing school system, Wilson was asked if that the problem with the St. Louis schools existed in other places, or was it worse in St. Louis? And Wilson linked the problem and its solution back to this notion of American aristocracy. She remarked, "I can't answer that because I don't know, but I suspect that there are good systems, but not good enough. And the key is that they ought to be everywhere. That's what this country is all about. You know, my whole philosophy is that we do not have an aristocracy of birth and class and wealth in this country. We do, however, have an aristocracy, though, and it's the aristocracy of people who have character and competence and accomplishment. And by that standard, anyone can be an aristocrat. If you've got character, competence, and accomplishment, and that's where we ought to focus. We ought to make it clear that the potential is here for everyone." If her vision seems somewhat utopian, this is not out of line with the pragmatist sensibility. For as philosopher Richard S. Bernstein has observed, without utopian aspirations, there is no moral progress. The utopian moment is not about the future, but about animating our motivation to change present injustices. Wilson's conception of natural aristocracy in America on the surface resembles the talented 10th concept of African American leadership coined by Henry L. Morehouse and popularized by W.E.B. Du Bois. Writing in 1903 in The Negro Problem, Du Bois observed the Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. The problem of education, then, among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented 10th. It is the problem developing the best of this race, that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst in their own races. When Morehouse and Du Bois's, whereas rather in Morehouse and Du Bois's talented 10th, we find that description. Booker T. Washington and the 9/10ths were examples of these self-made men, so-called, whose best powers were evoked by rare instances, in Wilson's view. The 9/10 through hard work and social justice could become members of the natural aristocracy. Speaking at the UNCF banquet in 1998, Wilson explained that in today's world, combining Du Bois's talented 10th and Booker T. Washington's agrarian mastery, the head and the hands must work together. Every young person needs to master something that requires using their hands and brain power. 3 tenets: character, competence, and accomplishment are the pillars for young minds. What confronts us daily are many leaders with competence and accomplishment, but they lack the 3rd tenet because they have character flaws. If we do nothing else, we must set the examples and encourage and nurture our young so that they will embrace and consistently uphold all 3 tenets: good character, real competence, and solid personal achievement. I do not know when Margaret first encountered Thomas Jefferson's notion of natural aristocracy. However, the idea had long been a part of Margaret's thinking, going back, I would argue, to her childhood. For her family and community had instilled the values that she subscribed to in this natural aristocracy. Margaret and her husband wrote letters during the war years, during World War II, from 1942 until 1946, after the war was over, when her husband had come back to the United States and was living in Chicago, and she was still living in St. Louis. And these letters are among the richest of the primary sources in her papers. And one of the letters to her husband, about 2 months, I think, prior to when they got married in 1944, is really telling of her thought as a young woman about these values that we find in her understanding of a natural aristocracy. She writes, "Saturday I was a guest at Mother's Club meeting. It was the Dames, this time a group of St. Louis dowagers, some of them quite moth-eaten. The club's 43 years old, and I'm afraid one of these organizations that places too much emphasis on heritage. Because past 2 generations, most of us don't know exactly who our forebears were. To my mind, whatever distinctions we make among ourselves as Negroes ought to be made on the basis of accomplishment and individual merit. Any other basis seems spurious and inept. And, of course, a rather obvious attempt to mimic one of the not too worthwhile or important customs of the other group. Of course, I have all my lofty ideas along with being included in whatever class is set up. Perhaps I'd covet being somebody more and attach more importance to exclusive clubs, etc. If I were excluded, guess I would, but at least I recognize the falseness of it all, which is more than most do, whether they are included or excluded." When the 25-year-old Margaret makes reference to accomplishment and individual merit and not heritage being the only legitimate distinctions that could be warranted among Americans of African descent, she gave a preview of what would become a critical piece in her understanding of the solution to America living up to its ideals. What America needed were American aristocrats. Beginning in the 1930s through the 1950s, a cadre of Black Christian intellectuals and activists who looked abroad, even in other religious traditions, for ideas and practices that could transform American democracy. This group included professors and public intellectuals like Howard Thurman, Benjamin Mays, and William Stewart Nelson, each of whom had met with Mohandas Gandhi. Ecumenical movement leaders, notably YWCA women such as Juliet Derricott, Sue Bailey Thurmond, and Celestine Smith, along with pioneers of African American Christian nonviolence, like James Farmer, Pauli Murray, and Bayard Rustin. They believed, as historian Sarah, I'm not going to get this word out tonight, I can't get her name out, I'm so sorry, has observed that a Black social Christianity nourished the international and interreligious resources that could fuel a movement for racial justice in the United States. This is a photograph of Juliet Derricott that I am about to speak on specifically. On November 12th, 1931, members of the Young Women's Christian Association of the United States gathered at their headquarters in New York City to memorialize the U.S. YWCA National Board member and former Student Secretary Juliet Derricott. Derricott had died 5 days before the memorial after being denied medical treatment in a white hospital following a car accident outside of Dalton, Georgia. Her memorial at the YWCA was a moment of domestic racial awareness. in that it brought the realities of segregation home to many of the members of the National Board. Historian Nancy Robertson remarks that Darricott's death sparked a shift within the USYWCA because of her ill treatment and how it revealed the systemic injustice of Jim Crow segregation. On May 3rd, 1939, during her senior year at Tuskegee University, Margaret Bush Wilson and her traveling companion, Elizabeth McCree, boarded the French ocean liner SS Normandy, arguably a contender for the title of greatest liner ever, and arrived in London 5 days later on the first stop on a trip around the world that was made possible by a Juliet Darricott Fellowship for Young Negro Women College Students. This is a photograph of the interior, one of the interior rooms of the ship. I've not yet discovered, and I hope that it exists in Margaret's papers, some description of their experience on the SS Normandy, because that would be really telling to us about these two young African American college students. Margaret was 20 years old. In March 1939, Margaret was awarded the scholarship by the Juliet Darricott Memorial Fund for undergraduate study in India. The scholarship was designed to allow female undergraduate students with outstanding scholarship to travel and study abroad. Sue Bailey Thurmond, the wife of the Christian mystic theologian Howard Thurmond, started the fund in honor of her friend, the late Juliet Darricott, a key member of the staff of the National Student Council of the YWCA. Sue Bailey Thurmond was an American author, lecturer, historian, and civil rights activist in her own right. She was the first non-white student to earn a bachelor's degree in music from Oberlin College in Ohio. She briefly taught at Hampton Institute in Virginia before becoming involved in the international work of the YWCA in 1930. During a 6-month trip through Asia in the mid-1930s, Thurmond became the first African-American woman to have an audience with Mahatma Gandhi. The meeting with Gandhi inspired Thurmond and her husband, this is the Thurmonds here, inspired Thurmond and her husband, Howard Thurmond, to promote nonviolent resistance as a means of creating social change, bringing it to the attention of a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. While they did not actively protest during the civil rights movement, the Thurmonds served as spiritual counselors to many on the front lines and helped establish the first interracial, non-denominational church in the United States. Thurmond established the Darricott Scholarship in the late 1930s. The first two recipients were Marion Banfield of Howard University and Anna V. Brown of Oberlin College. Banfield was the goddaughter of Howard Thurmond. The following year, the recipients of the scholarship were Elizabeth Beth McCree from Boston, who attended Fisk University, and Margaret Bush Wilson from St. Louis, who attended Talladega College. The Darricott Fellowship continued on for another year. And ironically, one of the problems that they ran into, in addition to the impact of World War II on fundraising efforts was the desire for men to be included as fellows for the fellowship. And Margaret Bush Wilson fought against that notion, as did Sue Bailey Thurmond. In a report prepared about the scholarship program included in Margaret's papers, Margaret and Betty described their experiences on their fellowship funded study travel tour. After sailing from New York, Margaret spent May of 1939 in London, Paris, and Cairo, visiting points of interest that included the Great Pyramids. The subsequent 5 months were spent in India while studying at Vista Bharati College in Bengal. Margaret attended classes in Tagore's literature, Hindi, Indian Constitution, Indian dancing, and Indian economics. And she had the opportunity to briefly visit with Pandit Nehru, who would later, of course, become India's first prime minister, and his sister, Mrs. Pandit, who was eventually appointed the first female president of the United Nations Assembly. After a visit to the Taj Mahal, Margaret participated in an interview with Mohandas K. Gandhi, the international figure and acknowledged leader of all of India, on November 9th, 1939. The fellowship concluded with visits to points of interest in and about Singapore, a slight sightseeing tour of Kobe, Japan, and a visit to Osaka, Japan, and about 2 weeks in Honolulu, Hawaii. On January 5th, 1940, Margaret returned to the mainland of the United States by way of San Francisco, returning to complete her senior year at the University at Talladega College, from where she graduated with honors in 1940. This is a photograph from a newspaper article in 1939. I believe this may be from the Pittsburgh Courier, but I'm not sure because I can't read the rest of it. The photograph is too large. But this was the announcement that you would find in several newspapers across the country about the Juliet Derricott Fellows. This is a photograph of Margaret while she was a student at Lincoln Law School. And this is a photograph of, also at Lincoln Law School, of her classroom. If you look over at the far right of the slide toward the middle, all the way over on the end, that's Margaret. And there is another female student that is sitting next to her. In the very front row, you see a gentleman who is looking back over his shoulder. Guess who that is? That's her future husband, Robert Wilson. And if you look all the way in the back, there's that one student that's always sleeping in class. The best slide is missing. I'm so sorry. I have a slide of Margaret in 1948 when she was speaking at a rally for Henry Wallace in St. Louis. And it has a marvelous poster behind her that has a message about working through the United Nations. So I just want you to imagine that I can't believe I don't have the best slide on here. But in April of 1948, Wilson became vice chairman of the Missouri Progressive Party, and became the first African American woman in the state to run for Congress, running on Henry Wallace's Progressive Party ticket. Proposing to run for peace, civil liberties, and economic democracy, Wilson recommended acting through, not bypassing the United Nations, to strengthen the PCA. She advocated a minimum wage of $1 per hour, repeal of the Taft-Hartley law, the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, which of course restricted the activities and powers of labor unions, price controls and rent controls, high taxes on excess profits, and nationalization of the munitions industries to eliminate getting a profit out of production for war. She opposed universal military training and peacetime draft and favored progressive reduction of trade barriers. In October of 1948, the musician, actor, and civil rights champion Paul Robeson campaigned on Margaret Bush Wilson's behalf when the young progressives of America, led by the Barbados-born and Harlem-raised communist militant Louis E. Burnham of the Southern Negro Youth Congress and Margaret Bush Wilson, asked W.B. Du Bois to sponsor their nationwide salute to FDR rallies. He complied. And future leaders like Wilson received some of their earliest political experiences in the Progressive Party. The historian Gerald Horne has observed that despite a literally murderous campaign of opposition, the Wallaceites must be given credit for weakening the walls of racial segregation. While I've not yet uncovered the immediate impact of the Progressive Party on St. Louis, other research has noted that there seems no doubt that the Progressives' adamant stance on segregation hastened the employment of Negroes as policemen in Memphis, Chattanooga, Baltimore, and elsewhere. Because of these pioneering efforts, the Progressives attracted broad and influential Black support. Lena Horne was elected to the National Board of the Progressive Citizens of America, along with Du Bois and his future wife, Shirley Graham, Paul Robeson, Bishop R. Wright, the Black publisher Roscoe Dunn-Gee, Dr. Carlton Goodlett, Dr. J.R. Johnson, Dean of Howard University's Medical School, and Margaret Bush Wilson. Helen J. Wilkins, a pivotal figure in the desegregation of the YWCA and the organization's first Black president, was serving as the Secretary for Interracial Education in 1941 when she reached out to Margaret with a request for her to contribute to a pamphlet under the general theme of democracy, religion, and race relations. The pamphlet, which would become one of the program papers published by the Women's Press, was used to foster the realization of a new concept of relationships between races as closely akin to a religious experience. How it was a spiritual experience, or how it leads to a spiritual experience. The student Christian movement in the South was suggested as a particularly right place where sincere and authentic views might be found. Margaret participated in the articles, writing an article for this publication, and in it she observed how, from her personal experience, she said that members of a minority group can be just as strong in their racial prejudices as those of a majority group. As a college freshman, she noted, "I had strong racial prejudices. There were sometimes two reasons for this. First, my school experiences had been limited to segregated schools, and as a consequence, there had been no opportunity to associate with students of other racial groups or to know the possibilities of friendship that could develop from such associations. Second, in going about the everyday business of living, it was not easy to escape all the discourtesies and humiliations for which my people had often faced. And it was not unnatural for me to develop a resentment toward those whom I believed had created them or were responsible for their continuance. At the time of the writing, June 25th, 1941, Margaret noted that for her, the change to a new concept of relationships between the races had been and still was becoming a gradual one, nurtured by each new experience with members of other races under favorable circumstances. The first of these came at an interracial student conference, which Margaret confessed she had at first had misgivings about. But step by step, from that conference, she learned and she added to her interracial experience, both in other conferences and in her trip abroad on the Aristocrats Fellowship. Increasingly, she came to realize that there is only one race. As she noted, groups of us may have similar physical characteristics, but we are all part of that great group, the human race, and we must act and react toward all people as individuals and as parts of the human race. We must begin to evaluate and appreciate the people we meet, with whom we meet, and with whom we come into contact, regardless of race. It is true that some of us are better skilled workers than others, or better writers, or better singers, but there is no such thing as a race of skilled workers, a race of writers, or a race of singers. While in India, Margaret had to correct some of her new friends, for some thought her to belong to a race of singers. In fact, one young Indian girl who had traveled and studied in Europe asked Margaret and her companion Betty to sing on one occasion when they were visiting with her in Lucknow, India. We both apologized for not performing and pointed out that we were not singers, whereupon she exclaimed in disbelief, "Why, of course you sing. All Negroes do. They have specially constructed throats." Margaret identified two things as most important in achieving a realization of a new concept of relationships between the races. First, an open mind accompanied by a desire to know people as they really are. Second, actual interracial experiences which is not limited in its nature and which affords an opportunity to gain insight and understanding about people of other races and their problems. For Margaret, these two factors combined to bring her closer to other people in a feeling of true brotherhood and sisterhood, and in what she said is just as important in her view, it brought her closer to God. The final piece that I'm just going to briefly mention, I'm not going to spend as much time as I have here in my notes, is just to remark about a series of workshops, seminars that Margaret participated in the early 1940s. The photograph here is of a man by the name of Henry Burton Sherman. Born in 1865 in Ontario, Canada, Sherman was the author of 10 major works on the teachings of Jesus. He was a Canadian New Testament scholar, and his singular mission during the first half of the 20th century was the meditation of the religion of Jesus to students and teachers in Canada, the United States, and China. A proponent of theological liberalism, Sherman was indifferent toward organized religion and sought methods of replacing dogmatic beliefs with awareness of the human Jesus's paradoxical message of redemption. The vehicle for the Sherman Method, as it became to be known, was the group seminar, using Sherman's records of the life of Jesus. This is one of his books here. Group participants were able to examine their religious preconceptions and to yield their wills to God's will unconditionally, to attain the realization of the fulfillment of themselves. This paradox, summarized in Luke 17:33, was for Sherman the great law of life. Margaret participated in what was called the Pine Lodge seminars, and she also participated in the Camp Menessing seminar in Ontario, Canada. And the way she came about finding out about this seminar was through Miss Celestine Smith, who became the first African American president of the YWCA movement. And I'm finding that there are a number of individuals in this somewhat small world who are influencing one another. And this was a part of the Christian student movement of Canada and of the United States. During the opening of this talk, I promised that I would come back to a set of questions that I posed, questions that serve to complicate what we might view as a progressive civil rights narrative. When Margaret Bush Wilson proposed a pragmatic and progressive relationship between big oil, big business, and big minority during her tenure as National NAACP board chair, she envisioned the African American civil rights movement transitioning further into the mainstream of America. In order to accomplish this, Wilson argued that the civil rights movement must thrust itself into the vanguard of into the vanguard of the world struggle for human rights and economic parity. The 1970s brought with it new realities that placed demands on the civil rights movement to create new platforms, form new coalitions, both domestic and international. The experimental nature of such a proposal reflected the very core of the philosophical pragmatist mode of operation. Yet there can be no question that her position on numerous corporate boards, the Monsanto Board of Directors in particular, had to influence her views on the relationship between energy and civil rights. Wilson fits the description of Black feminists who are simultaneously envisioning incremental changes and radical transformations, not only within Black communities, but through the broader society as well. Ultimately, as Stanley M. James has observed, the humanistic, visionary pragmatism of theorizing by Black feminists seeks this establishment of just societies where human rights are implemented with respect and dignity, even as the world's resources are equitably distributed in ways that encourage autonomy and development. Given Wilson's personal affection for Clarence Thomas, who was her mentee when he finished Yale Law School in 1974, I believe it was, John Danforth contacted Margaret and asked if he could find a place for Clarence Thomas to stay in St. Louis while he was studying for the bar. And she said, "Oh, he can stay with me. My son is away at Stanford, and I would love to have him." And so he spent the entire summer with Margaret and her family, and that began their relationship. So given her personal affection for Clarence Thomas, the question of whether she would support his Supreme Court nomination likely never entered her mind. Further still, Thomas represented Wilson's idea of a natural aristocrat. Wilson never gave any indication that she ever lived to regret having supported Thomas's nomination, although she did give indication that she was disappointed in what she saw as his inability to be able to think independently on the court, apart from his colleague, Justice Scalia. If Wilson and Thomas found themselves at opposite ends of the civil rights policy issues, an even greater dichotomy existed between Wilson and Schlafly's views on civil rights, women's rights, and LGBTQ rights. Yet Wilson actually greatly admired Phyllis Schlafly for her achievements. She likewise believed that Schlafly's views, like those of Thomas and her own, and of all Americans, must be understood within the democratic framework of the First Amendment right to free speech. Wilson had actually played a major role in determining that Phyllis Schlafly would receive the honorary degree from Washington University. Wilson's decision to present the citation for Schlafly's degree was perhaps as much influenced by her commitment to uphold constitutional rights as it was influenced by the power she likely felt in helping to get Chancellor Mark Ryton out of Dutch. Many who knew and who worked with Margaret Bush Wilson understood her as a complex person. As one observer recalls, she seemed caught in between two eras of civil rights history. I used to encounter her at different events in St. Louis and found her a complex and contradictory person, someone caught between two eras of civil rights history. So on some issues, Margaret would seem great to us, and on other issues, she would appear too connected to the Democratic Party on both the state and national levels. This was the remark of George Lipsitz, who was a teenager when he first encountered Wilson, and wondered how his youthfulness may have skewed his views of her. Yet others have remarked how they too also found her to be complex and somewhat contradictory. One feature of the human condition is that we all, in varying degrees, are complex and complicated beings. Yet as we can see in our nation's recent history and present, ideology is often allowed to take the driver's seat in our political and social discourse. We have indeed reached a point of divisiveness where we are beginning to raise the questions about whether or not we can focus on the ideals that we share in common. Can the principle of American democracy be reaffirmed in the face of such political and cultural divisiveness so that we may effectively work towards solving our society's problems? There can be no solution to poverty without solving the problem of poverty worldwide, Margaret Bush Wilson proclaimed. Racism and overpopulation concerns are symptoms of the zero-sum world economic order. These problems will not go away, nor can they be satisfactorily addressed, let alone resolved, without a total restructuring of our approach. The blame for our country's maladies and the world's maladies cannot be placed at the doorstep of the Republicans or the Democrats, the capitalists or the communists. In essence, our economic world functions independently of party politics and ideology. In arguing that Margaret Bush Wilson was a philosophical pragmatist, I am suggesting that some of her more controversial decisions were not motivated. I'm not suggesting, rather, that some of her more controversial decisions were not motivated in part by both principles and circumstances. Again, the choice between principles is complicated, as it is always in life, by circumstances. As Louis Manan has observed, when we think, we do not simply consult principles or reasons or sentiments or taste, since prior to thinking, all these things are indeterminate. Does this mean that our choices are arbitrary or self-serving, that standards and principles are just whatever it is in our interest to say that they are? Pretext for satisfying selfish ends or gratifying hidden impulses? Manan tells us that there is no way to answer this question except to say that it rarely feels as though this is the case when we are happy with a decision that doesn't feel arbitrary. It feels like the decision that we had to reach. And this is because the inevitability is a function of its fit with the whole inculcate set of assumptions of our understanding and the social world in which we inhabit. The assumptions that give the moral weight, much greater moral weight than logic or taste could ever give. The classical pragmatist and some other philosophers of the late 19th and early 20th century spent a good deal of time grappling with the notion of truth in a fundamental effort to determine if beliefs were true or untrue. Truth happens to an idea William James said in a lecture he published in 1907 as pragmatism. It becomes true, is made true by events. Its verity is in fact an event, a process, the process of verifying itself. A far deeper analysis than an overview than my presentation could possibly convey would reveal that beyond the strands of the classical pragmatism of William James and John Dewey and the prophetic pragmatism of Cornel West, Wilson's civil rights vision also reflected the visionary pragmatism that feminists such as Patricia Hills Collins, Stanley James, and Denise James have written about. Williams' pragmatism functioned as a tool in the realization of an inclusive American democracy that would not level difference and dissent, but would encourage social justice and cooperation. This final slide is of the French philosopher René Descartes, who lived from 1596 to 1650. I'm sorry, that didn't show up there. And I'm going to attempt to read this caption under it. It's actually a quote from Margaret Bush Wilson. I had been studying her as a pragmatist for about 2 years before I found this quote that told me that Margaret viewed herself as a pragmatist. Now, I didn't need for her to view herself as a pragmatist for me to continue to view her as a pragmatist. But she wrote to her son in 1980, and she was reading Descartes' meditation on the first principles. And she says, I'm reading Descartes, but I think I am such a pragmatist that I just accept the fact that we can't really know for sure about first meanings. So I just relate to the problems of the brothers and sisters, which I think I do understand. Thank you.
We have some time for a couple of questions from anyone. Over here. Oh.
Since you and I met at the Biographers Conference, I just wondered, as you've been researching and thinking about writing a book, how you balance sort of biographical approach versus maybe a more intellectual approach based on the issues, something like that.
That is the bane of my existence right now. I'm still working through that. And what I've finally done is to just kind of succumb to the writing process. I don't know exactly what world this biography is going to fit in neatly, if it's going to fit into the academic realm neatly. I mean, I dealt with intellectual issues tonight, but there's a lot that will be in this biography about the personal inner life of Margaret that will be not only of interest to academicians, but will be of interest to a much wider reading audience. And so it has not been an easy challenge to meet. I'm really feeling my way through it.
Okay, right here.
Okay, so I know you were talking about how Margaret went to travel around, and I know you said that you're in the process of like digging through all of her writings and things like that. I was just curious if you've read any, I don't know if she kept a journal or something, but just how she was treated overseas in like Asia and London opposed to in America, just because I'm in a Black Studies class now where we're kind of looking at Blacks in different spaces over in Europe and how they had different sentiments over there. So I was just wondering if you had any insight.
I haven't found journals from her trip abroad. Margaret did journal, however, but the earliest journals that we have found are from, there's one from the 1950s, and then it skips up to her time as National NAACP board chair in the 1970s and goes on from there. There are a number of documents, such as the report that I read from, that give some insight into that. And there are a number of letters that I am still going through between Margaret and family members, and I'm hopeful that I will find more of just what you have described.
Okay, we'll make this the final question.
Sorry. What advice do you have for young writers?
Oh, to write, you know, and really, I'm not saying that to avoid the question. It's a struggle, believe it or not, that I still have, and I have written and published a book. The only way to become a writer and to become better at writing is to write. And to be disciplined about it in the sense of just making sure that you write every day. I'm not really big on self-help books. I'm not saying that about self-help books in general. I just don't read a lot of self-help books. But one book that I have found extremely valuable is called The Artist's Way by Juliet Cameron. And she recommends doing two things. Doing morning pages, writing morning pages. You must write 3 pages a day. Stream of consciousness writing. If you can't think of anything to write, just write. I can't think of anything to write. But you must fill up 3 pages every day. And it is a very good practice to help you to really get those intellectual juices flowing and to stay in the practice of writing. So just continue to write. Do we have time for one more question? This young lady here had her.
Calling me a young lady, wow, that's so nice. Thank you. So I'm Joan Hermson, I'm the chair of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. I really want to thank you for being here during Women's History Month, talking about an important Missourian. But I feel like maybe didn't know anything about this person's history beforehand, but I feel like anybody who advocates for Phyllis Schlafly to have gotten an honorary degree is problematic to me, and I felt like your reading of her seems very generous, that, well, she supports the First Amendment. Do you think that history is going to be friendly to that in the end? I mean, to these women who supported conservative women's position in society like this? I mean, her advocating for somebody like her.
No,
I don't think you could do that today and have young black women on the internet be very supportive of that anymore.
Well,
so I think that's a moment in time.
No, it was 2008, and so it was not that long ago. The interesting thing about this, and I'm glad you asked the question, the interesting thing about this is in the citation which Margaret wrote. Now, I've not yet determined if there was a draft that was given to her, but I know that there was a lot of going back and forth with the draft. Margaret stated, on today, we are not honoring Phyllis Schlafly for her policies. We are honoring a persona. And then she went on to talk about how this nation is built on a foundation of free-flowing debate. Now, what I'm trying to do with Margaret, because there will be times when I say, oh, Margaret, how could you? But all of this fits totally within the philosophical pragmatist understanding of the world. It fits, and I understand what you're saying, but that's what I'm trying to get at. I'm not putting a value judgment on that. I'm trying to understand how she came to her decisions, and there are a number of things that I think helped her to come to that decision, including, as I said, the president of the university had gotten in hot water. Margaret was she was on the board of trustees. I think Margaret also took some pride in being in a position as an African American woman to help men and white men to help them get out of trouble. I think there were a number of things that went into her decision here. So, yeah, and we could talk more about this.
Okay. I just think that, can I just quickly respond, is that, 2008 was like before we have Twitter and all these social media. I just don't know that a prominent African-American figure such as her do something like that and be instrumental in the awarding of a prominent award to a woman of the far right who, didn't support women's rights, gay rights. I just don't know that space even exists today. So I wonder if she's sort of the end of an era of being able to do that.
I hope not. I really do hope not.
All right, let's thank Professor Dowden-White again for a wonderful lecture.